Welcome to the tutorial Deforming Basics. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over the Deformation Preferences, the controls, and all the icons in the Deformation Toolbar. So to begin, let's look at the preferences. If you're using Mac, you can go under Stage, Preferences to access the preferences. However, if you're using Windows, you'll find the preferences under the Edit menu. So let's go to the OpenGL tab. And under the settings, we have to be sure that use hardware shaders to render textures and gradients is enabled, so checkmarked, as well as use hardware vertex texture fetching if available. And this really depends on your computer's graphic card, but we're going to turn it on in this case. Then in the real-time anti-aliasing section, you have to be sure that this preference is actually disabled. So this is good the way it is, that there is no check mark. And then after we've selected our settings, we can say OK to validate them. So the next thing I wanted to talk about were the controls. So we saw a little bit of the controls in the last video. So to be able to see your deformation controls, the first thing you have to do is go to the View menu and select Show Control. So you're not going to see anything yet, but what you have to do is select the deformation chain that you would like to see the controls for. And you can do this either in the network view or the timeline view. So in this case, I'm going to select the deformation left arm, and then I can click on this button here, Show Control, or you can also use the keyboard shortcut. So on Mac, it's Command F11, and on Windows, it's Shift F11. If you'd like to see all the controls for a group, you can go into the group. So it's the left arm, and I'm going to zoom out so we can see the entire chain. Then you can use the keyboard shortcut Command A or Control A to select all, and then you can click on this button once again, Show Controls. So now we can see the control for the deformation uniform scale, which we put in place in the last tutorial. Then if you'd like to see all the controls, so not just for this arm, but also say for the elephant trunk, we can exit our group, either by hitting the top button here or by using Delete on Mac or Backspace on Windows. And you can once again select all by using Command or Control A. And you can click on this button once again, or like I said, use the keyboard shortcut. So I'm going to use Command F11. And now I can see all the deformation controls available. Another way of selecting all is by going to Edit, Select All, just in case you weren't aware, and of course the keyboard shortcut is listed there. So if you just want to see the controls for one group and hide all the others because right now they're all being seen, you can once again select that group and then go to the button Show Selected Deformers and Hide All Others. So now it's hidden the elephant but kept all the deformers for the arm. Then if you want to hide all the deformers, you can click on the button beside Show All Deformers, which is Hide All Controls. Or you can go back to the top menu and look under View, Hide All Controls. So it's underneath the Show Control. We have Hide All Controls, and the keyboard shortcut is Shift-C. So now let's take a look at the Deformation Toolbar. So once again, if you don't see it in your interface, you can always go to the Windows menu at the top, go under the Toolbar sub-menu, and select Deformation. So the first tool in the Deformation Toolbar is the Rigging tool. So let's click on that. And actually what I'm going to do is bring up the tool properties so that we can see it at all times. Keep the network view here so we can see that at all times. And I'm also going to hide these two drawings that have been deformed, and I'm going to bring up the one drawing that we haven't added any type of rigging to yet. So the rigging tool is a tool that you would use to create a deformation chain for a drawing. So I'll show you how to do this right away. We're going to select the drawing that we'd like to add the deformation chain to, and what I'm going to do is just click here on the shoulder, click for the elbow joint, click again for the wrist joint, and then click again for the hand. So a couple things happened here. First of all, the rigging tool recognized right away that I wanted to create a deformation chain with bones and articulations as opposed to curves. Secondly, a deformation group was automatically connected to this drawing in the network view as well as here in the timeline view. So the reason that the tool recognized that I wanted to make bones and articulations, first of all, is because I made a click without dragging my mouse. So let me undo this chain and start again. So if I actually click and drag the first point, oh, sorry, you have to select your drawing element again, and I click and I drag, so you can see a red line pull out. Automatically, we haven't entered the group yet, but a curved deformer has been created as opposed to articulations and bones. And so I might create something that looks like this for my curved deformer. So let's undo that. And let me once again create what I had before. Okay, so that's two different ways to create the two different kinds of deformers. And you may have noticed that in the mode section of the rigging tool that you can just use the rigging tool as is, or you can have the rigging tool only create bones and articulations. So even if you clicked on your mouse and dragged your mouse a bit to start, it wouldn't create a curve. Or you can just create curves. So these are better used when you know for sure you want one thing or the other, and this tool is used better if you're going to have a mix. So let's just look inside the group real quickly to show you what's created. So without you having to do anything except create a skeleton for your drawing object, already all of these modules have been grouped for you, and you automatically get a deformation root, an offset, of course the bone, articulation, bone, that we see here, your deformation composite, and the deformation switch. So those things are added automatically for you in your group. So let's take a look at the same deformation chain in the timeline view. Here it is right here. So the drawing object, the left arm with sleeve, was automatically parented to the deformation group, and the deformation group was automatically given the name of the drawing that's attached to it. So you can collapse the deformation group to hide the drawing, and then if you click on this plus sign here, you reveal all the contents of the deformation group. And in fact, it's everything that you see in the network view except for the deformation composite. So you see the root here, the offset, the first bone. We have the root, the offset, the first bone, etc., all the way down to the end here, where we end with the deformation switch. So the next mode that we have, or button that's in the mode section in the tool properties for the rigging tool, is the Show All Manipulators button. And I'm going to talk about this more after we've discussed the setup mode. It's the button right after. As you can see, you can also access it from the Deformation Toolbar. So we're going to skip over that and go to Show All Zones of Influence. So if I click this right now, we're not going to see anything. And the reason that is because if we look below here, we see that all of the regions of influence are set to infinite, and that's for articulations, bones, and curves. So with the rigging tool, as I was creating these bones and articulations, the influence had already been set. So if I'd like to change these parameters, I would have to delete the skeleton, change the parameters first, and then create my skeleton using any of these three modes for the rigging tool. So we can obviously change this after the fact, as we saw in the first video. So say I want to change the influence zone for this first bone here, I can go to the network view, select that bone, and then go to the layer properties for that bone, where we can also see the influence type. So I can change it from infinite to elliptic. And the only reason I'm changing it to elliptic is because then you can see a visual here in the camera view. And you can also access, once again, the layer properties by clicking on the yellow box beside the module in question. So now that we can see the influence type, we can come to these options here. So obviously the first one is the influence type, and we saw the four that exist before: 0, infinite, elliptic, and shaped, and I went over those in the last video. Next, we have the influence radius. So once again, increasing it here won't do anything because we've already created the skeleton. We can't modify the skeleton in this panel, but we can set the preferences for a skeleton that we have not yet created yet, or a rig that we have not yet created. The influence radius, of course, is only applicable to the elliptic influence type, as zero, infinite, and shaped influences do not have any set radii. So the bone ratio allows you to control the size of articulations that are created following the creation of a bone. So by changing this value, you can create articulations that are quite small even if the length of the bone is quite long, or quite large even if the length of the bone is quite short. So you can change that here. So just below we have the same influence type drop down, as well as influence radius fields for the bone and the curve. So the last two buttons we have here at the bottom are called operations, and the first one is the convert elliptic zone of influence to shape. So it would allow you to select a bunch of elliptic influences and convert them into shape influences, which would allow you to use the Bezier points and handles along the shape to change the form to something more precise. And the last operation is called copy resting position to current. So we're not going to use this yet. I'll once again also show you how to use this up here in the deformation toolbar, because we have not yet set our resting position. But it's good to know that these two buttons, as well as these two buttons, are also available in the deformation toolbar here at the top. So now let's talk about the setup mode. And the first thing I'm going to discuss is the difference between a tool and a mode. So a tool is something that you can use to create or manipulate objects in the camera view. And you can only have one tool selected at a time. So right now we have the rigging tool selected. If I want to undepress this rigging tool button, I would have to select another tool, such as the text tool or the transform tool, for example. Modes, on the other hand, work in conjunction with tools. So for example, you can have the zones of influence on because when you're using the transform tool, it's good for the transform tool to be able to see the zone of influence. The animate mode, for example, often works with the transform tool. So when you have it on, you're creating keyframes. With the transform tool, you're essentially animating. However, if you have it off, then whatever movements you make with the transform tool are not recorded. So that's another mode. So we're going to talk about the setup mode that you actually do use with the rigging tool as well as the transform tool. So you use them with both. The other difference between modes and tools is that tools have tool properties, of course, because they're a tool, where modes do not. So there is no mode properties panel for the animate button or for the setup mode. So in the setup mode, what I'm going to do, actually I'm finding this distracting, I'm going to turn off the zone of influence, is I'm going to set up the rest position, which we've talked so much about, or you've heard so much about rather, for this rigged arm. Sometimes when you first create your rig, it's not exactly in the position you would like it to be in, but of course you're just creating it quickly, so you draw it and everything's basically in place. However, for example, I might want the root of this skeleton to be a bit lower. So I can select the transform tool with the setup mode on and then drag it downwards, like that. And say I want the elbow joint to be slightly larger, I could do that. I could also grab it and drag it upwards so that its circumference touches the edges, the two edges of the sleeve, but that it sits directly in the middle. I could rotate this bone a little bit so that it's better in place and better aligned with the wrist. I could actually decide that I want the wrist joint to be more where the hand is and less where the sleeve is, so move that up. And I could take the end of the last bone and bring it in so it actually touches the inside of the black line of the hand. So now I've made what I think is a nicer version of my rig. However, if you click on the next button along the deformation toolbar, show all manipulators, you'll see that we also see in green our original rig. So before we made all these modifications. So red always means that it's the setup mode. You can think of red as stop, so not animatable, there are no actions being done, so red means no, and green means ready to animate. So this leads me into another button farther down along the deformation toolbar, and that's this button here, the copy resting position to current. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we have the entire deformation chain selected, because right now it looks like we only have the last bone selected. And we can do this by going to the timeline view and just clicking on the deformation group. The second thing we have to make sure is that we are no longer in the setup mode, that we do have the transform tool selected, and then we can click on this button here, copy resting position to current. So what just happened is now, instead of having that initial rig that we set up as being the resting position, the rig that we edited and cleaned up a little bit is now our resting position rig. You can see that's true because even though we have the show all manipulator mode on, we can only see one set of manipulators because the red is actually hidden behind because they're exactly one on top of the other. As we can see by clicking on the setup mode and disabling the show all manipulators. So now we can just see the manipulators for the setup mode in red, and if we click on the show all manipulators again, we can see it's identical to the manipulators for the active mode in green. And so what this means is that as you're animating, no matter what frame you're on, you can always copy the resting position to the current frame. So it's always good to have a resting position for your entire rigged character so that you can always revert back to that position. So the reason I said that you can use the setup mode with the rigging tool mode is that we rigged out of the setup mode, which meant that skeleton was thought to be an active green skeleton that's ready to be animated. However, if we had had both of these selected when we had started creating the rig, we would have actually been creating the red rig, the setup rig. So that's why I said you could use it with both, or you could just create your regular rig, fix it up like I said, in setup mode with the transform tool. So I'm going to turn both of these off. We already looked at obviously the zones of influence. The next button along the toolbar is show simplified manipulators. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit for us to see this. So right now we can see our control manipulators, and for the articulation specifically we see a double ring. So as soon as you click on this button here, it makes the center ring disappear. So really what you're working with here is you can still use this diamond, with the transform tool, to increase the radius of this articulation, and you can still use a square to lengthen the bone preceding the articulation. You just don't have the center manipulators, which allows you to make a rotation from here, as well as it seems like you can have a more precise deformation going on in the center of the articulation. So that's what that does. So we already took a look at the show selected deformers and hide all others at the beginning of this tutorial when we looked at how to show controls. So the rest of the buttons here right now are disabled. I think if I click in the network view and we go to the top and we select a drawing object, obviously this already has a deformation group already created for it, but what these buttons do is it allows you, just as the module library allows you, to set up your deformation group more from scratch. So let's go to the network view and actually disconnect this deformation group from the left arm with sleeve, and then select the same drawing element and then click on this button here which says insert deformation above. So now they're sort of blocking each other. This was the old group we had. This is the _1 version. So you can see now that a new deformation group has been added. But if you notice, you can't see any bones or articulations or curves, so any type of deformer on this arm. So let's go into the group and let's back out a little bit. And as you can see, it has many of the same elements that we saw when we created our rig using the rigging tool, but there are a few elements missing. So we do have the deformation root, we don't have the offset, we do have the composite, and we do have the switch. So if we wanted those things, the offset, if we wanted, let's say, some bones and articulations, we could just put them in manually from the module library and then start building our skeleton from scratch like this. And then you would have to go back to the camera view, click on the setup mode, and then use the transform tool to drag your various modules into position. So the offset, you could drag the bone out, you could increase the size of the articulation, etc. And that's how you would build your skeleton. So if we go back to the top of the network view, we can take a look at the next button, which is Insert Deformation Under. So this one I don't really have an example for to show you in the view currently, but what it was designed for was a very specific case, and that's if you have, say, a full cutout puppet rigged, you might have several drawing elements hooked to the same peg. For example, maybe the hand, the forearm, and the arm, just for example. And you'd like all of them to undergo the same deformation. Well, what you could do is actually select the peg in that instance, and then click on this button to put the deformation group in between the peg and the 3 drawing elements, and in that way it'll act on all 3 drawing elements. So the next button, which is also grayed out currently, also needs multiple chains to be activated. And it also is specifically designed to use with cutout puppets or rigs with multiple chains. And this allows you to output the kinematic only. So what that means is that you might want to insert several chains to a group that's already undergoing a deformation, but you don't want the chain you're about to add or the elements or the modules you're about to add to be influenced by that deformation. So then you can click on that button so that only the position information is output for that chain or group or specific element. So we already took a look at the copy resting position to current, and lastly we have the convert ellipse. So in order to show you how this works, I think I'm going to hook the old deformation group back to the left arm with sleeve just because it's more complete. Let's go into the group. Let's select the first bone, and it happens to have an elliptical influence type here, so that's good. So if we then click on the convert ellipse, which you might have realized just became enabled, you can see a bunch of contour points that have just become active. And you'll notice once again that we're using the transform tool and that we're in the setup mode. And you may also notice that the elliptic option has now been changed to shaped in the influence type dropdown. So if we zoom in, and let's select the bone once again, you can then use the transform tool to shape the zone of influence by moving around the Bezier points and pulling on the Bezier handle. Like that, for example. I'm just going to make something weird so that you can see that the shape really is unique. So say something like that. So that's it for the tutorial, Deforming Basics. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, creating a full character turnaround deformation rig.